Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Nice to see you all. I'll follow my normal format of muting everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you wish to ask anything on this rather sticky Wednesday evening. So our normal format, which is we'll do half an hour of Parsha, more or less, and then half an hour of Halacha. And we're starting this evening a new halachic topic within the broader context of Hilchos Shabbos. But for now, I want to look at the very famous opening words of the Sudra of Korach, which describe Korach's rebellion against Moshe and Aaron. And there's a familiar narrative which I'll first run through, and then I hope to be able to share a less familiar narrative. There's the standard version, which we've all often heard, and then I think a slightly different take on this. And the pasuk begins, the start of the Sudra, Vayikach Korach ben Yitzhak ben Kos ben Levi. I put in here the term Vayikach Korach. Korach took. It's an interesting way to describe the start of the rebellion. Korach, the son of Yitzhak, the son of Kos, took. It doesn't say actually who he took. Who did Korach take in this start of the rebellion, and what does it mean that he took? That's an interesting way to describe the start of the revolt. So there's a number of readings in this pasuk. Rashi brings them. Vayikach Korach, maybe he took people with him, he persuaded people, he schlepped and dragged people along with him into the rebellion, or perhaps he took himself, he adopted a certain stance in a certain position, and he chose to adopt a certain way of behavior, a certain viewpoint, and that's who he took. Now, it's clear they rebel. They gather against Moshe and against Aaron. That's pasuk base and pasuk gimel. However, the content of the rebellion isn't entirely clear. In pasuk gimel, their complaint is Rav lochem, you've assumed too much authority for yourselves. But in pasuk 28, all the way near the end of the parsha, when Moshe responds to Korach and his followers, he seems to understand that the core of the rebellion is a denial of the truth of his mission. And therefore in pasuk 28, which is about halfway through the first page, Vayomer Moshe, this is Moshe's response now to Korach, and the unrolling of the punishment they're going to get, the famous punishment they're going to get. Vayomer Moshe, pasuk 28, Bezos teidon ki Hashem shalachani, lasos es kol ha'ma'asim ha'ela ki lo milibi. Through this, you should know that Hashem has sent me to do everything I've done. It wasn't me libi, it wasn't from my heart. I wasn't just making this up. And then he says, if you die, pasuk 29, im kamois kol ha'adam yumusan, if you die in a natural manner, or for kudas kol ha'adam yipoked aleim, and you end up with the normal fate of all humans, you die the normal way a person does. Lo Hashem shalachani, Hashem didn't send me. However, the imbria yivra Hashem or potzah adamos pia, if the earth opens up its mouth, then at the end of pasuk 30, pasuk lamed, v'yadatim ki niyat ha'nashim eiles Hashem, you, the rest of the people will know that these people have defied Hashem. What was going on here was a terrible defiance of God himself. So this is the outline of the rebellion, and of course we know the continuation of the story, the conclusion of the story, that indeed the ground opened its mouth, proving seemingly Moshe's point. Now, in this reading of the story, Korach adopts the stance of a classic heretic. He doesn't believe Moshe's agency. He's perhaps a denier of the prophecy of Moshe to a greater or lesser extent. Perhaps he disbelieves the whole authenticity and authority of the Torah itself. And therefore he complains to Moshe, you've adopted all these things, you've made them up yourself. What's at stake here is Hashem shalachani or not? Did Hashem send me or not? As Moshe says, this is niyut of Hashem. This is a real, almost heretical defiance of God that is going on over here. That's really what's at work. That's what's at stake. And therefore this event is a very important scene, a very important stage in the journey through the Midbar. It's an attempt to really deny the whole foundation of our faith and our trust in the emunah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our faith in Hashem, and the shlichus, the agency of Moshe. So this is one reading of the Psukim. Now, a potential challenge to this reading is found on page 2 from the Rambam in Perek Ches, chapter 8 of Yesodei Torah. Now, the topic of Yesodei Torah, principles of faith, Yesod means a foundation, the foundations of the Torah. This is the section in the halachic work of the Rambam, in which he deals with matters of faith and belief. As is well known, the Rambam wrote more philosophical works, his Moreh Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed, but his Mishnah Torah is his magnus opus. It's really his large halachic work, and in it he sets himself the task of paskening, halachically ruling for every aspect of Torah. There's no halachic work before or since that covers such a wide syllabus. Not only does he pasken what we'd expect him to deal with, kashrus and Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah and the laws of marriage and divorce and everything else that you might want in regular Jewish life. He also covers kodshim, the laws of Bonhams, and taharos, the laws of purity and impurity, which aren't so practically relevant nowadays in the sadly in the non-Beis Hamikdash world. And he also paskens matters of belief. So this is the section of Mishnah Torah called Yesodei Torah, where he rules on matters of belief. And there's a very interesting piece in chapter 8, in which he speaks about what is the foundation of our belief, and he is skeptical about using miracles as the foundation of belief. He says miracles are, they impress people at the time, but their impact, their ability to use them as a foundation stone for true, genuine belief is very, very limited. They're not really impactful. This is part of a general trend, which I'm not going to discuss too much at length here. For those who are interested in my Sunday shiurim, Sunday morning shiurim, which are philosophy-based, my series on life's big questions, we looked at the view of the Rambam about miracles. The Rambam doesn't really think that miracles, regular miracles, are such an ideal. Hashem created the world, and for it to need constant tinkering with miraculous intervention isn't really the way it should be. He created the world, and look how he described the creation of the world in the first chapter of Bereshis. He says it's kitov, it's good. Hashem wants the world to function in a regular manner, and that way there's space for us human beings to use our intelligence and our reason to function, to cope, to know what's going to go on, to know what decisions to make. Hashem interfering with it, in a sense, unravels the whole purpose of creation. It undoes creation. It's very nice when miraculously fire doesn't burn something, but that's counter to creation, in which trees that catch alight are designed to be burned, and their properties of wood is that it burns and fire burns, and the miracle is contradicting the nature itself. So Rambam is not a fan of building too much upon miracles, and this he elaborates upon in his first halacha in chapter 8, and he says the basis of belief is not a regular miracle, it's the events of Matan Torah, it's the events of the giving of the Torah. The events of the giving of the Torah aren't a regular miracle, they were prophecy. The whole of the Jewish people heard the words of God. They heard the words of the divine at that moment in time. This was a direct encounter with Hashem. The Rambam in his Guide to the Perplexed discusses how this encounter happened, how could non-prophets achieve prophecy, and he speaks there about what it means to have a clarity of vision and a direct contact with God. But again, that's not our discussion for today. But the Rambam says the giving of the Torah, that is the moment of clarity. That's the basis of belief. And the Masorah, the tradition that we have that attaches us to that event. All the other miracles that happened in Jewish history are great, or not great, but they're not really the basis of a firm groundwork for emunah. This is what the Rambam says in his Perek Ches Halacha Aleph, first halacha of the 8th chapter of his Yesodei HaTorah. Now, in this, he comments and he discusses, so what is the role of all the miracles that happened? I mean, why did Hashem split the sea? Why did he give them miraculous food to eat in the desert? Why did he let the rock be hit and give off water? And the Rambam answers, these are necessities for the exigencies of the time, for the needs of the time. The purpose of these miracles wasn't a matter of founding our faith. They were necessities to cope with what was going on at the time. So let's just read together a piece of Rambam and then try and translate this back to the story of Korach. Moshe Rabbeinu, so this is the top of source 2, Lo Heminu Bo Yisrael, the belief that the Jews had in him was not Mipnei Ha'osos She'asa. because of the otot, the signs, the wonders that he did. Someone who believes based on signs and wonders, there's always doubts in their heart. But lots of the Kishuv could be that the miracle is done through some other means, through magic or through some technology or something like that. Miracles are difficult to be really certain of. I mean, anyone who watches a conjurer, a magician at work in performing, I mean, I if someone told me that was a miracle, maybe I'd also believe them. They saw someone in half, and then miracles are miracles. They come back to life and they're alive again. They put someone in a box and they turn invisible. They light something and it doesn't burn. So they produce things from nothing. So these are miracles. So people can be gullible to rely upon miracles for the basis of belief. The Rambam is not convinced that's a very good grounds for really believing. Again, controversial view of the Rambam, perhaps, yes, but this is the view of the great Rambam, and to get something that we really, that the philosophy series is more the appropriate forum for. But then carries on the Rambam, all the wonders that Moshe did in the wilderness, why did Moshe do them if they're not about faith in Hashem? And the answer is, says the Rambam, they were done for the necessities of the time. Not to bring proof for prophecy. Was Moshe needed to sink the Egyptians in the sea, or Korah or split the sea, and they sank in it. The purpose for this was not because of proving anything, but because they were in danger and the Egyptians had to be disposed of. Sarachnu lemazon, we needed food. Horid lana samon, therefore the mon was delivered. Somu, we were thirsty. Bakal hamas evan, therefore he split the rock and out came water. Kofru ba'adas Korach, the community of Korach rebelled against Moshe. Bala'osam ha'aretz, and therefore the ground swallowed them. V'chein shah ha'osos, and similarly all the other proofs. So the Rambam here is claiming that the reason why miracles happen is to deal with a particular need, but not because of any great fundamental of faith. This is the view of the Rambam, who thinks that the reasons to believe are because of the events of Matan Torah, more philosophical groundings, but don't base belief on miracles according to the Rambam. However, in this the Rambam says that the reason miracles happen is to deal with a particular situation. We're thirsty, so we got water. We're hungry, therefore we got mon. The Egyptians were chasing, therefore the sea split. Korach rebels, therefore the ground opened up and swallowed him. Now this is quite a neat way of disposing of Korach, that's true, but that's not what the Pasuk says. The Pasuk says that Moshe is proving belief in his agency based on the miracle that would occur. So how does the Rambam read these psukim? What does the Rambam do with these psukim, in which it seems quite clear that Moshe is saying, this is how you should know that God sent me, and if the miracle doesn't happen, then lo Hashem shalachani, Hashem didn't send me. This seems to be in flat contradiction to the view of the Rambam. So again, the question is quite simple. The Rambam says that the purpose of this miracle is to dispose of Korach, not to prove the fundamental truth of Moshe's shlichus, his agency, and the truth of his prophecy. And the psukim seem to say that there is some proof element in this. How does the Rambam understand read these psukim if he argues that this isn't about proof? Now, the reason why I wanted to speak about this topic tonight is because there is a thesis, an essay of the great Rabbi Chanan Wasserman in Source 3, which has entered into common parlance. And it's become so mainstream an idea that I think everyone just sort of says this and quotes this and believes this as if it's an absolute fact. And whilst Rabbi Chanan is clearly saying something of great importance, I don't think it's quite that simple. And I think there's reason to believe that there's different ways of looking at this particular point, and that Rabbi Chanan is not quite as black and white as one might think. More than that, the core thesis of Rabbi Chanan is one that is not really found in earlier sources, and many later commentaries disagree about this. And I want to share it because I think it's important to know that there are two perspectives on this matter. And Rabbi Chanan, here in Source 3, a little bit of background. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman is a student of the great Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. He is a Rosh Hashiva in Europe before the war, in Baranovich. Very, very choshev Rosh Hashiva, one of the most important teachers of Torah, the Rebbe of numerous Gedolim, really, in the next generation. Rabbi Chanan traveled the world fundraising for his yeshiva. He came to England on several occasions, America. He was in America when the war broke out and chose to go back to his flock to shepherd them. He didn't want to leave his community, Baranovich, and his yeshiva behind, and was martyred around these days, actually, in Tammuz, in a pogrom that took place in Kovna, where he was resident at the time, a Lithuanian partisan-led pogrom. He was not murdered by the Nazis himself. He was murdered by their Lithuanian allies. Now, in literally the first couple of weeks of Tammuz, we don't know exactly when he died, but sometime in the first week and a half of Tammuz. Now, Rabbi Chanan Wassman writes as follows. He says he's addressing an issue that bothers him, and he says that the Torah imposes upon us all sorts of mitzvahs and obligations. From very young age, from bar mitzvah, a person is obligated to keep the tenets of our faith, and included in these mitzvahs is the obligation of emunah, to believe in Hashem. Number one. Number two, Rabbi Chanan argues that B'nai Noach are also obligated to believe in Hashem. This is another discussion whether this is indeed the case or not. Again, perhaps not for today. And this includes everyone, even those who are very far from the monotheistic faiths. So if you're lucky enough to be living in Europe or Africa or Asia, you may have come across one of the monotheistic faiths, the Abrahamic faiths. But if you live in North America, South America, 600 years ago, you'll perhaps never meet a monotheist in your life. And nonetheless, you're obligated to be a monotheist. You're obligated to believe in Hashem. Which means that effectively we're demanding of every bar mitzvah boy, every bas mitzvah girl, every Aztec and Inca 600 years ago in Central America, to believe in Hashem. That's the mitzvah of emunah. How can we demand this in any fair and just way when we know that these are matters of profound philosophical depth? We find great thinkers, the Aristotles and Platos of the world, that don't come to this conclusion. And yet the Torah seems to impose this as a mitzvah on every little bar and bas mitzvah, boy and girl. How can we expect them to adopt belief and emunah when these are such difficult and troubling philosophical ideas? And Chanan's answer to this, quoted extensively and in many ways become the mainstream thinking on the matter, is that emunah, belief, is pashut. It's simple, something very easy to do. Anyone who opens their eyes and looks honestly at the world sees a fantastic world, sees a world created clearly by a great designer, and understands that such a world doesn't appear from itself, and therefore would adopt a stance of emunah. What is it that makes us struggle with faith, says Rabbi Chanan? Bias, negias, an agenda. Because with faith comes a whole heavy burden to bear, an implication. We're no longer the masters of the universe because there is a master of the universe. We're no longer free because we're beholden to our creator. We're no longer able to do what we want because we're commanded in mitzvahs. There's a halachic framework that restricts us, that imposes upon us expectations, limits our freedom to make up our own minds and to do whatever we want. And therefore, there's every reason in the world to resist the ideas of emunah. And this is a classic application of that bribery and bias can distort even the thoughts of very wise and clever people. And this, he says, is what goes on in the minds of those who struggled with belief, of the Platos and Aristotles, the great scientists and philosophers who don't believe. How can we ask of an uneducated farmer in Central America 600 years ago to believe? How can we ask of our little boys and girls at Bar and Bas Mitzvah to believe? The answer is because belief is not a complicated business. We overcomplicate it. We sometimes make it into too big a deal. It's a very simple thing. Look at the world, and if you look straight in an honest and straight manner, one will automatically believe. So says Rabbi Chanan Wassman. I just want to spend a few minutes fleshing out his argument and seeing, based upon that, how he deals with this Rambam and gives one possible reading in the Rambam. And based upon this idea of Rabbi Chanan Wassman, we understand the Korach story. And Rashi really sort of alludes to this. If we go back to page 1, the source 1, Rashi says, what made Korach at the bottom of page 1, bottom of source 1, what made Korach decide to quarrel with Moshe? He says Korach was a clever man. Korach b'keach hoya. How on earth could Korach mess up in such a terrible way? And that was just because Korach had an agenda. He didn't like the division of power in the Jewish people. He felt he should have had a more prominent position. He felt his unique qualities and talents weren't being rejected. He thought there was nepotism going on over here and that Moshe is favoring his own immediate family. He doesn't like what he sees. Basically, it gets down to me. It gets down to my ego, my power, my covered, my respect. And that's what leads the rebellion. And there's no other reason that Korach could have made a mistake over here. Now, this ties in neatly with Rabbi Chanan's idea. It doesn't prove it. Of course, it's possible that people blind themselves with their own agenda and own bias, and I think we encounter that if we're honest every day in our own self-reflection and in our interaction with other people. We see very often a particular goal, a target, an agenda, a want, a desire can warp our judgments, and we find ourselves rationalizing and justifying our decision-making process in a less than completely honest way. But that's not the question over here. The question over here is this the only reason and the only doubt that can creep into faith? But carrying on Rabbi Chanan's thesis for now, Rabbi Chanan's idea for now, we can answer the Rambam's question. Is it really true that Moshe needed this miracle to support himself? Absolutely not. Anyone honest would have understood what's going on. This is, after all, Moshe Rabbeinu, who took them out of Egypt, who brought the 10 plagues, who led them through the Yam Suf, who ascended Har Sinai. He's been Moshe, who has been the ever-faithful Roya Naaman, the faithful and loyal shepherd of the Jewish people. They saw and witnessed and heard the events of Matan Torah themselves. There is no true theological battle going on over here. If we view Korach as a bar palugta, a real counterpoint, a real figure who is entitled to argue with the Moshe, and think that what's going on over here is there are two sides, two possible views, we've misunderstood the story. Korach is in truth, for all his wisdom and all his qualities and all his talents, he's a nothing. He's led mad, driven to the point of craziness by jealousy, by the green-eyed monster, by his resentment of the power that Moshe has, and his frustration that he isn't equally recognized and powerful, and that distorts his judgment. And therefore, in truth, the Rambam is right. The only reason for this miracle that takes place is to dispose of Korach. So what is Moshe saying by Bezos Teidon Ki Hashem Shalachani? Through this you will know, and if it doesn't happen, Lo Hashem Shalachani, and V'yidatem you'll know Kniyat Anoshim Eidas Hashem, you'll know this is a rebellion. What Moshe is saying over here is, you should know and understand from this miracle that occurs that there never was an alternative. I don't want you, the witnessing Jewish people, says Moshe, to think that there's 2 points over here, 2 viewpoints, and that Korach is representing a serious position. If Korach dies a natural death, I don't want you to come out of it that he was wrong. I want you to understand that there never was such a serious possibility. I want you to realize that what took place over here was never a real argument. This wasn't, sometimes when you hear people arguing, and I think this is in many cases a position that we should adopt in life, but it doesn't always serve us well. Sometimes we should try and empathize. We should try and understand what's the other point of view. But there are points of view that we shouldn't try and understand. There are points of view which are driven by a fundamental dishonesty, by a distortion of the truth. We need to best empathize and put our minds into our honest and sincere people that argue with us. Those that read history or circumstances in a different narrative, a different version of events, ones that don't necessarily make us comfortable. But empathy with someone who represents sheer evil? Definitely not. Moshe over here isn't interested in the Jewish people thinking that Korach is onto something, albeit wrong. He wants them to understand he's fundamentally undermined. There never was a serious argument. There's always about Korach's agenda. And this is what's going on in the miraculous destruction of Korach and his forces. This is one reading of the story. Now, I want to argue that this Rabbi Chanan Wassman is not quite that simple, and that there's another reading of what's going on in this story. So 2 really separate points. First of all, just quite simply, this view of Rabbi Chanan has become in my view, less than helpful stance when it comes to debating matters of faith and Cursive and the like, in which the believer comforts himself or herself that the only reason for disagreeing is because of bias, because of an agenda. And actually you get the game being played both ways. So the non-believer says, you know what, the only reason people believe is because they find it comforting, maybe they enjoy being part of the community, maybe they like the idea of having a father figure in their life, a God who's protective and looks after them and provides meaning and provides guarantees of safety. And on the other hand, you have the non-believer, the believer who says, well, the only reason people disbelieve is because of bias, they don't want the restrictions and the controls and the master in their lives, etc. And competing over whose agenda and whose bias is more significant isn't a particularly helpful way of dealing with things. More than that, it would appear that there are things in life which one can genuinely struggle to arrive at the correct conclusion to. And let me just give you a simple example, because this is really fundamental in our understanding of how our minds work. And this is something pointed out by the Balei Musa, who really probed and specialized in the depths of understanding human thinking. And they weren't happy with this model of bias being the only reason we can't arrive at the truth. And let me just give a simple example. If I ask all of us here in this Zoom share now, what is 433 divided by 27? Hopefully all of us, if we took a pen and paper, could work it out. But it would take us a certain amount of time. Now, those who are better mathematically maybe would be able to work it out in 15 seconds. Those who are less inclined mathematically, maybe it takes them 2 minutes or 5 minutes. But there's nothing fundamentally impossible in the sum. But nonetheless, it takes us time to do, because the mind takes time to process things. This is the nature of our minds are not pure thinking machines. We are beings of flesh and blood. And therefore, if it can take us time without any agenda, without any bias, to arrive at a simple truth like the most basic of mathematical sums, surely more complicated questions of life, such as purpose and meaning and emunah and our relationship to Hashem, can also take us time to work out. Now, how long does it take us to work out? Well, the simple mathematical sum is maybe a matter of 15 seconds. Or maybe if you're a little less mathematically able, it's be 2 minutes or 5 minutes. But maybe when it comes to very complicated questions of emunah, this can be a lifetime journey. And one can sometimes have ups and downs, and one can struggle, and one can work on this. And not necessarily because there's a simple bias there. Because there's no bias that was discouraging us from working out this sum. I mean, if we had to work it out, maybe we would be lazy, maybe we'd choose not to work it out. But in principle, even if there's no bias, it would still take us a certain amount of time. There are things that are complicated, that are difficult to work out. There are ideas in science and philosophy that only very gifted individuals can understand. So it can take time to achieve certain sorts of insights. And therefore, the idea that the only reason someone might struggle with their relationship with Hashem and with their emunah is because of a bias isn't necessarily correct. It's certainly a factor, certainly something we have to take into account. What are our biases? What do we want to be? What's driving us? But equally, we need to realize that sometimes these things are complicated. So this idea that the only reason we can reject emunah is because of a bias is not such a simple idea, and certainly not the approach of the Balei Musa who discussed these concepts. So this is point one. Point two, though, and linked a second stage of this is that there is an alternative reading in the mission of in the message of Korach. And here I want to remind ourselves of how we actually understand our relationship to Torah. And this is a fascinating idea, because in our conception, our understanding, Torah is a partnership between the human and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We know that there's Torah Shebiksav, the words of Hashem, and there's Torah Shebal Peh, which consists partly of an oral tradition, but also of the expectation upon each and every generation of Torah learners to use svara, to use reason, to use their minds to try and understand what Hashem wants from us. And we only need to open a page of Gemara, or Mishnah, or Machshava, or whatever chelek of Torah, whichever type of Torah we're learning, to see this. It's full of argument, full of discussion, in which people are trying to hear the Devar Hashem, they're trying to hear the word of God. The understanding Chazal had of Torah is that in Torah we're hearing the words of the divine, we're hearing the words of the infinite. Each and every one of us human beings has to strain our ears to try and hear what Hashem is saying. And for that reason, Shivim Ponim the Torah, there can sometimes be many legitimate ways of hearing what Hashem is saying. These and these are the words of the living God. There's a partnership going on in our attempt as humans to hear the words of Hashem, and Hashem who's speaking. The truth is, in every communication, it's like this. When I'm speaking over here, one might be tempted to say that I'm the sole person creating the communication that's at work over here. I'm speaking, I'm creating the communication. But this isn't correct. Because if I was speaking to nobody, if no one was listening to my words, I'd simply be saying syllables. That wouldn't be communication. It's because there's a hearer, a listener, who's receiving the words, that out of the combination of the two of us, the communication is being created. Which means to say the listener is a co-owner of the communication. Okay, but we might still think that the one that carves and molds and gives meaning to the communication is only the speaker, because the listener is passive. But that's also not correct, because each and every person listening hears this in their own way. They understand this with their own comprehension in their own minds. They integrate it into their own system of thought with their own unique talents and experiences and way of thinking about the world. And therefore each listener hears it slightly differently. And in fact, everyone hears it very slightly differently to how I meant it. In some respects, you hear it better than how I meant it because you're fitting it in to your own life experiences and your own history. This is what we mean, at least partially, by the concept of Torah Sheba'al Peh. We partner with Hashem in creating Torah. Now, who is entitled to partner with Hashem? Okay, obviously it has to be someone who learns Torah in the fullest way, someone who learns it without a bias, someone who's a competent and qualified learner of Torah, Talmud Chacham, who has the ability to master the corpus of Torah and translate it and understand it accurately. There's 70 faces to Torah, there's not necessarily a 71st, there's still room for error. But fundamentally, if we hear Torah in a certain way, and we hear it in the most honest way, then this is how Torah is offered. Now, we're used to this in the context of halachic life. But the truth is, it even hits to the most profound level of interaction with Hashem and how he runs the world. We see this in Avram's encounter with Hashem. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Will the judge of all the land not do justice? And Hashem feels a need to respond and justify himself to Hashem, to Avram. And in fact, Avram, he says, I'm about to destroy Sodom, and I'm not going to conceal from Avram what I'm going to do, because I need and I want Avram to understand what I'm doing. Hashem wants us to live in a world in which we can understand, within the appropriate framework and parameters, how Hashem is operating. And this gives the ability to the Chachmei HaTorah, at least in the order and the league of Chazal, to sometimes steer the very Hanhaga, the very way the world is run. And I just want to share with you a phenomenal Gemara on the bottom of the 3rd page, and this is in source 6. And I only put here the Gemara. It's a Gemara in Baba Kama, and I put it in English. A very difficult Gemara. A lot needs to be discussed in it, and we're just going to have to look at it very briefly, and I want to bring out one point from it. Our rabbis taught, this is a brisa, it happened that the daughter of Nechunya, this is Nechunya who used to be Chayfa Boris, used to dig wells. So in Eretz Yisrael, there's a perennial potential for drought and for shortage of water. And Nechunya dedicated his life to digging wells and creating reservoirs and pools of water in order to ensure that there was enough water supplies for the particularly the people of Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim, of course, suffered or benefited from a population surge at the time of the Shalosh Regalim, and his water supplies weren't enough. Now, the daughter of this Nechunya once fell into a deep, deep pit. When people came and informed Reb Chanina ben Dosa about it, he kept on reassuring them, kept on telling them, she's well, she's okay, she's fine, don't worry. Eventually, it turned out indeed that she had survived, and they asked her, who brought you out? And he said, she answered, I saw a ram which came to my help with an old man leading it. This is an allusion to Avraham Avinu and the story of the ram with Avraham Avinu. Be that as it may, they then turned to Reb Chanina ben Dosa and they said, are you a prophet? Are you a Novi? How do you know she survived? He said to them, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. However, I exclaimed, shall the thing to which the pious man had devoted his labor become a stumbling block to his seed? That means to say that Reb Chanina ben Dosa held, he was of the view, that it was impossible that Nechunya should be punished in this way. It's impossible that Nechunya's daughter should die through the very means of the extraordinary chesed that he had done in creating reservoirs and pools of water for the people of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim. Now, this isn't a hanhaga, this isn't a mode of operation through which Hashem runs the world generally. In fact, we don't have time for this story. The Gemara carries on and says that Nechunya's very son died of thirst. Meaning, once Reb Chanina ben Dosa was no longer around, to argue with Hashem that this isn't the way of justice, it's impossible that this should occur. This wasn't the manner through which Hashem ran the world. The pathway through which God runs the world is carved out by his desire to have a relationship with us, with those who genuinely care and build a depth of relationship, and he wants us to understand how he runs the world if we live up to that expectation. And therefore, a great figure, and this is not a sort of a Hasidic philosophy of the wonder rabbi, the Hasidic rabbi who can create miracles. This is a Gemara teaching us that the depth of relationship that's possible for us to have with Hashem is such that those who are genuinely Chachmei Torah Sheba'al Peh can argue and say, we don't see the justice of this, we don't understand this, and we need to understand you. We've dedicated our lives to understanding you, and therefore this has to fit in with our comprehension. And very briefly, it would appear in a careful reading of the sources that it is this that was Korach's complaint to Moshe. We don't have time to explore this idea fully, but it would appear that this is part of what's at work with Korach. Korach is not a denier of the events of Matan Torah. He isn't a denier of the primary giving of the Torah. However, he argues that Moshe is using his relationship with Hashem to steer the continued way that things work. And by the way, we know that on occasion this happens. Moshe does sometimes take the law into his own hands. He comes down from Har Sinai and he sees the Egel Azav and he smashes the Luchos. Moshe is capable of independent action. But Korach here is arguing that Moshe is using the molding power of Torah Sheba'al Peh to steer the Torah in a certain direction, to create a certain sort of Torah. And this is a second reading of what Korach, the depth of Korach's complaint against Moshe, and Moshe's response to this, which he says, Lo me libi, this isn't from my heart, Pasuk Kaf Ches, Vayomer Moshe bezos teidem ki Hashem shalachani la'asos es kol ha'masim eila, ki lo me libi, this isn't from my heart, which the Targum translates as lo miritzoni, this isn't from my will, this isn't my will in which I am directing and molding what the Jewish relationship to Hashem ought to be like. I am a clean and transparent slate in which I'm trying to act merely as a bridge between the Jewish people and Hashem in understanding spirituality. Korach's argument, Moshe is molding the spiritual direction of the Jewish people in line with his own spiritual work, in line with his own spiritual taste. And this is possible and this can happen sometimes. This is Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa arguing, I can't relate to a God to allow someone, a daughter, to die in her father's wells that he himself has dug as an extraordinary act of chesed. But this, says Moshe to Korach, is not the person I am. This isn't what I'm doing. I'm not interfering in the nature of the relationship. We run out of time. In fact, we've gone over a little bit our time. I hope this gives us a different look at the story of Moshe. I would urge you, I've given out quite an extensive source sheet this week, beyond the amount of sources that we're able to go through today. But I hope if you have a look at the other sources that I printed, you'll get a fuller picture of what I think is an important and profound idea. We'll pause there and we'll use the time that is remaining to us to speak about Hilchos Shabbos. And we start this week a new set of halachas, and these are the halachas of writing on Shabbos, Cursive, and its twin malacha, moichik, erasing writing on Shabbos. Now, I'm doing this as a follow-on from Seveya, dying, which was our last malacha that we looked at. However, in truth, these are very different malachas. They are superficially similar, and I'm moving from one to the other because it's certainly true that in the realm of practical halacha, there's sometimes an overlap, and sometimes something might be Seveya, might be Kotev. But in the concept of Malacha, there are very different ideas. Just to remind ourselves, Seveya is about beautifying the surface upon which you are colouring. It's dyeing and it's colouring. It's about the ink, the colour, the paint, becoming negated to the surface upon which it rests, to which it becomes attached, and beautifying and adorning that, colouring that, as opposed to Kotev, writing, in which the ink or the marker is being used to create a spreading of ink which carries its own significance within it. It carries within it a communication. It's a sign or a symbol that carries and conveys information, a letter, a number, a picture in some shape or form. The point of Cursive is that the ink does not become bottled. It doesn't become negated or nullified to the surface upon which it's written. On the contrary, it has its own significance as a letter or a number or a symbol. The point of Seveya is that it colours the object and becomes negated to that and serves merely as an adornment or colouring of the object. So the malachas are very fundamentally different. They also are quite far apart in the order of malachas. I already mentioned in my introduction to Seveya that the 39 malachas are divided into 4 sets, dealing with the 4 most primary and basic human needs that we have. There is the order of cooking, which is baking, which are 11 malachas to do with food production. That's one order, food, one basic human need. There is a second order, which is to do with sheltering, a third order, which is to do with clothing, and a fourth order, which is to do with communication. Now, Seveya appears in the clothing order. It's along with a series of malachas to do with producing strings and threads and shearing and creating wool and cleaning the wool and then dyeing it into a final color. Kotev belongs to a completely separate order of malachas, which are part of an order of producing parchment and writing communication for human needs: food, shelter, clothing, and information. We need information, we need communication, and that's where the malacha of Kotev comes in. It's a different order of malacha. Now, we may think when we set out on our journey together to learn these halachas, one may think, why on earth do I need to learn these halachas? How on earth is Cursive relevant to me as a Shabbos observing person? I'm now, of course, I'm never going to write on Shabbos. And we'll see over the next couple of weeks as we learn these halachas that it's not quite that simple. I'm not at this point trying to puskin anything, but I just want to give scenarios where we might want to think, does Cursive or doesn't Cursive apply? At this time of lockdown, I've had far more shiurs than usual about board games. Scrabble, is that a problem with Cursive on Shabbos? Rummy Club, I'm putting letters, I'm putting numbers together, I'm putting letters together to produce words. Is this a problem playing such a game on Shabbos? Making a puzzle, is this a problem on Shabbos? I'm piecing disparate pieces together to create a picture and an image. Is that a problem of Cursive on Shabbos? If I attach magnets in a series to the fridge, or these felt pictures that children sometimes play with, where they stick them to a felt background, is this a problem of Cursive? Is using a strip thermometer which displays lettering a problem? We spoke last week about a mug on which an image appears as I pour hot water in. Is this a problem on Shabbos? Birthday cake inscriptions. How many simchas? Well, we used to go to simchas in which one has an image, a photo on the top of the birthday cake, or perhaps a lettering and a notation, or perhaps a pair of tefillin, or whatever it may be. Is one allowed to eat such a cake or such a roll which has lettering on it on Shabbos? Walking on snow or on mud with shoes that emboss words, is this a problem on Shabbos? Window condensation, if one etches out a smiley face on a window on Shabbos, on the condensation, is this a problem? So there's a whole variety of cases where if we're not reflective upon our Shabbos practice, actually we may have really interesting questions about whether we can and can't do these on Shabbos. In addition, Kotev is one of the most impactful malachas in terms of Bonhams, because Chazal created a whole realm of activities on Shabbos that we shouldn't do because of their association with writing. And I'll just mention a few of them, but again, this will really demand separate shiurim. But in certain cases, measuring and weighing is forbidden on Shabbos, because very often when we measure a weigh, we record. That's why we measure away something, in order to record the weight. And therefore, this is connected to a family of Bonhams around that. Business is forbidden on Shabbos. Transactions are forbidden on Shabbos for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because it's not Shabbostic, it's not right in business on Shabbos to engage in buying and selling and weaning and dealing. But there are transactions which are very far from that, just giving someone an innocent present. And yet there are rabbinic laws associated with this to do with not engaging in any transactions, because when one engages in a transaction, very often one will write a contract or write a note of the deal, and therefore there's a risk of writing. So there's a whole variety of things which end up forbidden on Shabbos because of Chazal extending the prohibition of writing to all sorts of non-Shabbos appropriate activities, and we will get to them, but I simply mention them at this point in order to bring out how central understanding this malacha is. We shouldn't feel, well, we don't write on Shabbos, and therefore this isn't really something of direct relevance to us. So let's get down now to the nitty-gritty. What is this malacha of Kotev, of writing on Shabbos? What does it include, and what doesn't it include? So the classic form of writing is a surface upon which one forms a letter. And I use my words with care, because a letter can be formed on a surface in a number of ways. The simplest way of creating a letter or a number or whatever it may be on a surface is using ink, is writing on the surface. And that certainly is the classic example of Kotev, of writing, this malacha. But in addition, one could etch onto a surface an image or a letter, scratch it on. One could emboss it. One could stamp it. There are other ways of laying ink. There are other ways of creating an immersed letter, a letter that's embossed or embedded into the material, or indeed, for that matter, carving the letter out so that it ends up as raised and elevated on the surface. And all of these are included in Kotev, in the malacha of writing on Shabbos. Moichek, erasing, we'll get to later when we look at its twin malacha, but to some degree or other, the malachas are symmetrical. They're two sides of the same coin. Kosev writing and mechika erasing, but we'll look at that in more detail. There is another set of possible ways of creating lettering, which remains to this day controversial. It's not clear whether this is included in Kosev or not, and that is shaping out a letter when it's not on a surface. So if I carve out a statue, which is an image, or I carve out an enormous capital letter A, it's not sitting on any surface. It is the surface. It's just the body of a text. Is this included in the malacha or not remains a little unclear. So piecing together pieces to create an image out of the pieces themselves, like lining up pieces of food to make a shape, this remains a little unclear whether this is included in the malacha of Kosev, of writing on Shabbos or not. And we're going to see this has profound halachic significance. But these are the two classic ways of forming Kosev, either lettering on a surface, whether through writing, whether through stamping, whether through carving or shaping, but it's on a surface or into a surface or on top of the surface. This is the malacha of Kosev. If I form something into the shape of the letter, it may not be Kosev. Kosev may be writing onto something. Introduction number one. Introduction number two is that it includes any symbol which contains meaning, conveys information, carries content. Now, the simplest example of these are shapes that we have agreed societally to the idea that they convey meaning. So these are letters and these are numbers where we have agreed that they convey meaning and have content to them. This is whether it's in the English language or Hebrew or Chinese. It doesn't matter whether it's a language that's commonly spoken in our corner of the world or not. As long as these are shapes that convey meaning, that is enough for it to be included in Cluesive. Then there can be shapes that convey meaning because they fundamentally convey meaning. A little image or sketch of a stickman or a house, an outline of a house, and certainly a more complicated picture, if I paint or draw a whole picture, or perhaps if it includes sculpturing, as I discussed before, sculpturing a statue or a model of someone. This also is symbolic and conveys information. Why do I call it symbolic? After all, it's an accurate picture. Maybe it's an identical, almost photo of the thing that I'm trying to capture. That is correct, but nonetheless, it's still only symbolic. At the end of the day, it isn't the object itself. However lifelike the statue of this horse that I'm building may be, it's a symbol of a horse because it isn't a horse itself. However accurate the picture I paint of the palace is, it conveys information of what the palace looks like, but it isn't the palace itself. So this is included in the malacha of Kosev because it conveys information. Now there are shapes which my intention determines whether they convey information or not. A very basic shape, like a line, could be nothing, it's just a line. It could be the letter I, in which case I have written a letter on Shabbos. Or it could be a line where, I don't know, I'm reading a book and I come across something interesting and I want to underline this line so that I remember it and that I go back to it and I can find it. In which case this line is also conveying information. What information does it convey? It conveys the words above me are important, read me and notice me. So the same simple line can be nothing. One shouldn't do it on Shabbos, it would be a drabanan, but if I take a pen and I just draw the line randomly without any thought at all, it carries no information whatsoever. I draw the line with intention of it being the letter I, in which case it could be a malacha, or I use the line to underline something, and again I'm using it to convey information, in which case it could be the malacha. So it depends upon intent sometimes whether a symbol carries any particular halachic significance or not. So this is the second point of introduction. Kosev means forming a shape, an image, a symbol that carries information and meaning, and whether it does or doesn't sometimes is determined by an absolute criteria, like the picture. Sometimes it's determined by societal convention, like the shape of lessons, and sometimes it's determined by my own arbitrary or subjective use of shapes, because to me it carries a symbol. In halacha, this is known as, by the way, as roshem. Roshem means making a marking, And even just drawing this line is an example of Kotev, of writing through the method of Roshem, because it carries a content or a specific message through it. So this is the Malacha of Kotev. Third principle of Kotev, which I hope by now will be familiar, the concept is based upon Surveyor, dyeing, that we previously learned, the same parallel halacha to it, which is that it has to have some degree of permanence. And again, we have the same three categories as we found in Surveyor. One has permanent, which is Aweso, is the Torah prohibition. One has temporary writing, which is Rabbinic. And then one has of no permanence whatsoever, which is not even Drabonon, doesn't have any Rabbinic prohibition at all. So writing, which is permanent, nothing lasts forever, as we discussed with Surveyor. All things eventually fall apart, all things eventually fade. But writing which has a permanence to it, in which it's going to remain for an extended period of time, perhaps for a day, perhaps for a week, is Kotev writing which is permanent and is also min haTorah. Writing which is temporary is only also Drabonon. The very classic example of this is writing on condensation on a window. The condensation will perhaps disappear in a very short amount of time. The day will heat up and the water on the window will evaporate. Nonetheless, it is also Drabonon. And then when I was writing, which is considered to have no permanence at all. Now, if you press your finger against a shiny surface, a glossy surface, a varnished tabletop, for example, the natural moisture and grease in the finger will leave a mark. And you could use this finger marking to create a letter which will last for a few seconds. If you press down, you can just press down on a glossy surface, you'll see that it leaves a mark, and then it dries and evaporates within really a few seconds, 3, 4, 5 seconds, and there's no mark left at all. And even when it was there, it was only apparent and visible with great difficulty, even a meter or two away, one couldn't see it. This would be mutter, this wouldn't be included even in the Drabonon of Kotev and Shabbos. Now, in practical sense, I'd be a little bit cautious with this, because sometimes if one's finger's a little greasy, it will leave a more permanent mark. But at least in principle, something that really has no permanence at all would be mutter completely. So permanence, as always, is a factor in Malakas. The concept of why permanence matters is the same as we discussed in Surveyor in dying, because a Malacha is a creative act. I need to be making a difference to the world. Which leads us on to the final principle that I wanted to share today in looking at the general rules, which is that of mekalkel, of damaging, destructive writing, as opposed to positive writing. All malachas have to be an act of creativity, of producing something, as opposed to an act of destruction and negation. Now, there is always a reason why we human beings do things. We may have a good reason why we want to destroy something, but nonetheless, if it's an act of destruction, it's not a malacha as far as Torah law is concerned. Let me give you an example. I mentioned already that moichik, erasing something, is a malacha. Now, moichik, like all the other malachas, and like Kotev itself, has to be constructive, not destructive. So if I erase something in which I'm removing information from the world without laying the groundwork for new information, something new to be done, that is a destructive act, even though there may be a very good reason why I'm doing it. So if there's a check that I wish to cancel, or communication that I want to erase and scratch out because I don't want anyone to be able to read it, there's a very good reason why I'm doing this act of erasing. Nonetheless, since it's a negative act, it's an act of kilkul, of removing information, it is not the Torah prohibition, even though there's a purpose in what I'm doing. Which sort of moichik, which sort of erasing, or for that matter, which sort of writing would be a malacha? Writing which adds information, or moichik which cleans paper so that it can be used for making new writing there. So if I rub something out to write something else in its place, that's a constructive erasure. It's an erasing done in order to create new writing, new information. If I rub something out because I don't want it there, I've got a very good reason for doing it. There's a motive in doing it. But nonetheless, the motive is a negative motive in the sense that I want to remove rather than create, and therefore this wouldn't be chayav min Torah. And it's not the Torah prohibition of writing or erasing. And if I take out my pen and I rub out something, I paint, I sort of color over some writing that I don't want to be seen, This is not an act of Kotev. Writing is not an act of moichik, and it's only rabbinically forbidden, not forbidden in our Torah. Now again, that means it's asa, absolutely asa, but it's important just for us to understand what the structure of how the halachas are created. In Torah law, this isn't prohibited because it's an act of destruction. In rabbinic law, it's prohibited for obvious reasons, but nonetheless, in terms of amir akum, of asking a non-Jew to do something, there are all cases of emergency. It's important to understand these concepts. Now, what's also important to understand here is that we look at whether it's creative or destructive very narrowly. We look at it only in the narrow parameters of this particular malacha. So if I have an expensive oak table, and someone, a member of my family is popping out to visit a friend, and they want to let me know that they're popping out. So they take a knife, my kitchen knife, and they scratch onto the table, Dad, I'll be back in an hour or two, gone to our cousins. This would be the melacha of Kotev, even though they've ruined my beautiful and expensive oak table. It's a destructive act in terms of the quality of the table. In total, in my judgment, the value of the communication was outweighed by the loss and the damage of what they've done. This was a wanton act of kilkul or vandalistic destruction. Nonetheless, as far as the lettering is concerned, it was a positive and creative act. It was a proper and legitimate act of communication. They created new information in the world, permanently written down information, and therefore this would be included in the act of Kotev, and would be considered a Torah prohibition because it was a constructive act, not a negative act. So this is the principle of Mekalkel, and the fourth rule that I wanted to share today. Couple of, using the minute left to us, just a couple of other examples of Kotev, what is and isn't Kotev. There are ways, particularly in modernity, of storing information that does not fall under Kotev. And this is the various electronic devices that we use to store information. A electronic photo that is taken, or an essay that I type out on my keyboard on my computer and then click save on, and that now gets stored on the flash drive in my computer, is not Kotev, even though I've stored information. It doesn't fall under the definition of Kotev of writing, according to most poskim, because no letter exists, no symbol exists that carries information. All that exists is a series of magnetized plus and minus points in the silicon chip, or whatever it may be. And this isn't a symbol that carries communication. It simply allows electronic circuitry to work in order to draw out information. This would be different to the old-fashioned microfilms or microfiches, for anyone who remembers what they are. In that case, you also needed a piece of apparatus to see the letter, but the letter was there. It was physically present. It was just tiny, and you needed a very powerful microscope to enlarge the lettering to be able to see it. For those who are less technologically minded, a computer disk does not work that way. You don't have little etching of the letters, which you need the computer to magnify. It simply is no letters at all. It's simply the magnification, the current created, which conveys the information. So this will not be included in the malacha of Kotev. That's one example where there isn't the malacha of Kotev. And then you could have the malacha of Kotev in other surprising ways. Someone who uses their fingerprint, for example, to authenticate something, that would be an example of Kotev, a modern example of Kotev, because we now know and understand that everyone's fingerprint is unique, and therefore my fingerprint conveys information. What does it convey? I was here, and I authenticate this document. A criminal who accidentally leaves fingerprints will not be doing Kotev, because as far as Torah law is concerned, because they have no wish to leave their fingerprints. But if I consciously leave my fingerprint as a way of showing that I saw this document and approved of it, or I was here, then that would be a modern example of Kotev, because it's a unique symbol which each of us has been created with by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but we're using that symbol to convey our identity, and therefore this would fall under the malacha of Kotev. So these are a couple of examples of what would and wouldn't be Kotev, and Emir Hashem next week will apply some of these principles to paskening some of the shilas that we raised at the beginning of this share. I'll stop there because I've run out of my time, and wish everyone a good evening. And if anyone wants to unmute themselves to ask a question, they're welcome to do so, but I'll stop there, and thank you all so much for joining. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been interesting.
Thank you very much.